So the fourth recommendation relates to reading text, connected text every day, daily. Again, prior to the intervention research, there are decades of research, 30, maybe even 40 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, just observing in classrooms, in special education resource rooms, in special education classrooms, general education classrooms, observing how much time students get to practice reading text is what most of the studies were. Some of them were practice reading text when they could get feedback or correction, which would of course have to be oral. And a few studies that even looked at just any kind of print. How much time do students get, like in kindergarten, to practice saying the letter sounds when a letter is put up, or reading a word, let alone the connected text. And very similar findings across all of them, particularly for the oral chances that students get, so chances with feedback. Anybody want to guess how many minutes a day an individual student gets practice with that typically in all of these different settings? What'd you say? I didn't hear you, sorry. 12 minutes. Any other guesses? It's less. 8. It's less. And what's interesting about it is how similar it has been across the decades. Typically, access to practicing orally print, and some of this gets back to what Carol was talking about earlier, where there's a lot of individual students being called on. But typically, it goes over and over again, it ends up being about 1 minute. And of course, for good readers, they're getting a lot more because they're reading more text on their own. They probably find it enjoyable as well. And that may not be with feedback, but they've got skills that are allowing them to capture more vocabulary and understand more context and think about that text and monitor their comprehension. But in terms of instructionally, and this is across elementary grade levels, across, like I said, years and years. So we really have to think very carefully about some of the delivery aspects Carol has been talking about to really get students to be able to practice with this print. And then think about this recommendation, which is not surprising given that observational research that when students in an intervention are given daily opportunities to read connected text and apply all of these things that we're trying to teach them, they do better with their reading. This is a moderate evidence because there are a couple aspects that kept it from strong evidence, but it is 22 studies that this recommendation is based on. So that there gives us a lot of replication. 18 of those had positive findings on word reading, oral reading fluency, or comprehension, or a combination of those. But what kept it from being strong and is keeping it at moderate is sometimes they would have good outcomes on, say, comprehension, but not on the word reading. Not negative outcomes, but not necessarily progressing any more than typical instruction. So they were a little bit mixed, not across the studies as much as they were different measures, what it was affecting. There were some mixed findings. So that lack of consistency gives us the moderate evidence versus the strong evidence. With 22 studies where you can get positive, or 18 of those studies where you can get positive outcomes on any literacy measure would certainly lead to this recommendation. So we have 3 action steps there. It is students reading orally, that there's modeling of strategies, scaffolding and support, and providing feedback. So giving opportunities where you can provide some feedback, or a stronger reader, or you can have partner reading and you're walking around. We'll talk about different ways to do that. But students are getting support and they're paying attention to accurate and efficient word identification, so the accuracy aspect of reading. Teaching them to self-monitor their understanding so that they can make word correction errors, or word corrections, as they're reading when they make errors. So again, that they're reading accurately as they're doing that. And opportunities for oral reading practice with feedback so that they become more fluent as well as accurate in their reading. And that really takes practice. I mean, we can practice all the other things. They can be read to. They can get a little bit of practice with reading. They're not going to become very fluent without their own practice. So that 1 minute is simply not going to be enough for students with feedback. So these action steps are a part of that recommendation, and let's look at some ways that you can implement that.
All right. So with this recommendation, too, with the reading, it's where we're bridging from those discrete skill practice pieces to students reading those connected text pieces for meaning and comprehension, right? So that's really where we want to get kids to that point that reading is automatic enough to them that their brain power can go toward that strategy, the strategies that they're using for meaning and for comprehension. When I work out in schools with teachers, I start, when we talk about reading and connected text and fluency practice, I start by telling them that what I want your goal in all of your classrooms, in your schools, in your districts to be, is that every day, every student has an opportunity to sound and feel like a fluent reader. So I'm going to say that again. Every day, every student has an opportunity to sound and feel like a fluent reader. I did not meet that goal when I was a teacher. Now I know some things that I could have done differently so that I could have reached some of those students and given them an opportunity. So I say to teachers, students that don't feel like a reader, how do they feel about reading? Frustrated, they hate it, right? They'll tell you. They'll come right out. They're very honest about it. They'll say, I hate reading. And usually you'll ask them why, and what do they say? Because I can't, right? They'll say, I can't. But if they have an opportunity to sound and feel like a fluent reader every day, how do they start feeling about their reading? Yeah. They start feeling more confident. If that boy that stood up and said, this is the best day ever, you know, I can read, why was it the best day ever? Because he felt like a reader. He heard himself as a reader. So what happens when they feel like a reader? What are they going to do more of? Reading. And if they're doing more reading, they're going to get more fluent. They get more fluent, they're going to spend more time in text and get more vocabulary and then get to that comprehension. So thinking about that goal, every day, every student has an opportunity to sound and feel like a fluent reader. Should be a goal in every classroom, in every school, in every district where students are. So then, how do we do that, right? That's tricky. And most of the time it's because we don't necessarily have all of the right resources for our students. And also, we aren't going through that skill practice in order for kids to be able to read a text with accuracy that we're presenting for them on what that is. So one of the things that we want to think about is that frustration level, instructional level, independent level. So it's that level that students can read a text where they're not having to go sound by sound by sound of every single word in order for them to get to that point of fluency. So it's being really smart about the text that we're using with our students and what we have available. And so we'll spend a little bit of time in this last session as we're talking about that. So that independent, instructional, and frustration level that we have there. But the action step is students read orally, model strategies, scaffold, and provide feedback to support accurate and efficient word identification. So that means that you as the instructor that's working with the students, has to make sure that you're providing that immediate feedback to the students and modeling what those strategies are so that the student gets to that point of sounding and feeling like a fluent reader. One of the parts of that is providing time for the students to use their decoding strategies after we've gone through that skill practice so that they know they have the skills to be able to read those and having that connection. All right, so let's look at the next one. So, and in the action itself is cut off just a little bit, but it's the same as the last one. So for less advanced readers, look for parts you know, sound it out, check it, does it make sense? You know, so providing some of those prompts, you know, for the students, and what does that mean? For more advanced readers, you know this word part, say the part. So what Jeanne was just talking about, helping them identify those word parts within connected text, so that when they're reading, you can guide them back to that strategy that they practiced. You know what that word part is. We have that prefix, you know, that we just talked about, you know, and how we pronounce that, and we're able to figure out then what that whole word is, and then they can read that whole word. So it's breaking it down for them and providing that step-by-step practice as they're reading. Often when I go out into schools too, I'll see a lot of classrooms where teachers will have a small group of students that they're working with, whether it's tier 1 instruction or typically your tier 2 is a smaller group, and the teacher spends the entire small group time doing skill practice, and they never get to that connected text reading, and that's a big mistake, you know, that we make, that it has to be this part of it is just as important as the other pieces together. So action step 2, teach students to self-monitor their understanding of the text and self-correct word reading errors. So this is an activity, and I'm going to go back to, we haven't shown you all of the videos. In fact, I can show you, I want to show you the website right now while I'm thinking about it. All of the videos that we've talked about, or 2 of the videos that we've talked about, the practice guide website that you can see right here. And so it's the ies.ed.gov and Southwest. I actually just Google REL Facilitators Guide. If you put that in the search box, it will come up with this website, but it's on there as well. So this is where that the Facilitators Guide is here. These are where the handouts are for the different activities that go along with it. And if we scroll down, these are all of the YouTube links to all of the videos. One we watched this morning and one we're going to watch now. So all of the videos that are lined up with all of the different action steps that we've talked about and these 4 recommendations are linked right from this page. So I wanted to make sure that I showed you guys that as well, so that as you're looking at how do we guide teachers through using some of these strategies, here are some of the links to those YouTube videos. It is not. If you would like it, I'll give you my card and I'll email you a link to it. And one person from a district would be fabulous. So yeah, it isn't on there. Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and let me go back and let's look at what we want to look for before we watch this video. So let me go back to this slide for just a minute. So, and I'm going to read it to you because it's super small up here on the screen. So this video viewing guide for what we call the Fix-It game for this action plan. So it illustrates a small group of students reading orally while the teacher facilitates the self-monitoring and self-correcting activities. So that's what we're going to be watching for. So the characteristics. So same thing, get a blank piece of paper, do the T-chart. The left side is going to be notes, and then the right side can be that reflection discussion as we talk about it afterwards. So number 1, what did the students learn? So take down notes of what the students are learning. Lesson delivery, so the instructional procedures, modeling, stating the objective, guided practice, all of those instructional components that we talked about at the beginning of today. Materials and resources that were used, focus on the teacher feedback to support accurate and efficient word identification. So write down notes, write down exactly what are some statements that teachers are using to focus on that accurate and efficient word identification. So what strategies strategies did they model? What were some scaffolds that they used? And then how did the teacher support students in self-monitoring for understanding and to self-correct for word reading errors? So pay attention to those things and write down notes in those areas.
Competent readers can recognize when the text does not make sense because they have misread a word and can correct their mistake. Teach students to monitor their understanding as they read and correct word reading errors when they occur. These strategies can be integrated with word reading and fluency instruction.
All right, friends, we are going to do a lesson today when we practice making sure that when we read, it makes sense. It has to look right, but it also has to make sense. And there's a question that might help you if you're reading. You can ask yourself, did that make sense? And if the answer is no, you need to go back and try to fix it so it can make sense. Okay? We're going to do a game called Fix It to practice. So here's a sentence. And if I read this sentence and I read, the bus stepped at the corner, does it make sense?
No.
Turn back to me. Who would like to share your thinking? Did it make sense? No?
It didn't make sense because the buses, they can't really step, and a bus really doesn't really know how to step because it's really high speed.
Can you guys fix it? Go ahead.
The bus stopped at the corner.
Now, does it make sense?
Yes.
Great. And it also looks right, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I noticed some of you talked about the O. All right, let's try another one. On his birthday, he turned 8 years old. Does it make sense?
No.
Chris?
It doesn't make sense because it would have to be changed to a OU instead of an EA.
So it also doesn't look right to you. But does it make sense to say on his birthday he turned 8 years old?
No.
Why doesn't it make sense?
Because years and yours just doesn't sound the same.
Great. Can you guys fix it?
On his birthday, he turned 8 years old.
Now, does it make sense?
Yes.
All right. So now you're going to practice this on a text that's a 3rd grade text. So it's called The Big Hike. And in this story, Tamara is so excited to go hiking with her family and her brother James. When you're reading, you're going to read in your head. But when I lean over, I'm going to start with Madison. I'm going to ask her just to read out loud so I can hear her. And then if you make a mistake, I'll ask you, does that make sense? And we'll work together to see if you can fix it. Okay? All right.
Today, Tamara was wide awake and excited. Today, the family...
All right, so friend, right here you said, Tamara was wide awake and exit. Does that make sense? All right. Can you fix it?
Yes.
All right, you want to reread and see fix it?
Today, Tamara was wide awake and excited.
Does that make sense? Great fixing.
Tall trees and tiny flowers blended both sides of the path.
All right, so right here you said tall trees and tiny flowers blended both sides of the path. Does that make sense?
Blinded.
It's the word lined. There you go. Now reread and see if it makes sense.
Tall trees and tiny flowers lined both sides of the path.
Do you know what that means, that they lined both sides of the path? So if there's a path like this, and you can walk on the path, here on both sides are trees and flowers, and they're in a line beside the path, and that's what lined means, okay? That'll help it make sense. All right, great job.
There were trees with long dropping leaves that Tamara had never seen before.
Okay, right here you said there were trees with long draping leaves that Tamara had never seen before. Does that make sense? You know the tricky word? Which is the tricky word, do you think? There were trees with long draping leaves that Tamara had never seen before. Okay, want to try it again?
There were trees with long drooping leaves that Tamara had never seen before.
What should we read? You start the beginner reading. So I'm thinking this might be a word that you're not familiar with, so it's hard to make it make sense. So this vowel is going to be long A, and it's going to be the word draping. And so what draping means is the leaves are draping like drapes or like curtains, like they're falling down and covering. Okay, you want to try it again?
There were trees with long draping leaves that Tamara had never seen before.
So now that makes sense to me. I know it's an unfamiliar word for you. Okay, great job. Keep going.
The idea of this fix-up game is that they're trying to teach them to read for accuracy. And if it doesn't make sense, we have to learn to self-monitor and correct it. That's what the evidence is telling us, is that students that learn to read with that accuracy, that it makes sense, and when it doesn't, they go back and fix it, are going to get to those higher outcomes. So this activity was teaching them, if it doesn't make sense, what do we have to do? Fix it, right? Does that make sense? Fix it. That's the idea with it. So on the second part of that video where they were reading the text of the students, they were reading for fluency practice. It wasn't the first time they had read through it. They'd already talked about the story. They had already gone through and gone through their lesson with the text. This was purely for fluency practice. And she was listening to them. And when they read and it didn't make sense, what would she say? Yeah? Does that make sense? Let's fix it. And she was monitoring for them during that fluency reading. And that's really what we're trying to show with that too, is as the teacher, you should be using that language and modeling for the students. If it doesn't make sense, we have to fix it. Because if it doesn't make sense and we get to the end of the story, what's going to happen with our comprehension? We don't have comprehension, right? If we're not reading for that accuracy, we're not going to have comprehension because it doesn't make sense. So we have to make sure that we're teaching students that. All right, let's look at action step 3, unless somebody had another question with that one. I didn't ask, I don't think. All right, so let's look at action step 3. Provide opportunities for oral reading practice with feedback to develop fluent and accurate reading with expression. I'm going to go on, I'm going to come back to this one in just a minute, but I want to go on to this. I should have had this slide a little bit sooner, and I'll put it down. So I'm going to go on to this slide, and then I'm going to come back to that. So when we're looking at fluency instruction, there are 3 parts of fluency, and the first part of fluency is accuracy. And when I work with teachers and I say if we do not send that message to our students, again, starting in kindergarten, that when we read, our first and foremost thing that we're focusing on is accuracy, we teach students it's okay to mumble over a word that we don't know what it is. And when we mumble over words that we don't know what they are, we don't have strong comprehenders. So that it's really important that we set that expectation early, that when we read, I want to see that you're reading without making any mistakes. That's the message that we're sending for that accuracy. So we're going to use those skill practice things that we've talked about in the other recommendations to get kids to be able to read with accuracy. But that's going to be what our first focus is. Once, and I always say this too, once students can read with accuracy, then we can work on that prosody or expression, that your voice sounds interesting, that you're paying attention to punctuation, that you're pausing between the sentences, that you're doing all of those different pieces. And then those are where we're going to model and do some echo reading in order for our voice to sound interesting when we read. But we're still going to read without making any mistakes. We're still going to have that focus on that accuracy piece. So the video that we just watched had to do with the accuracy piece, right? If it doesn't make sense, you have to fix it. And then the last part of fluency is rate. We can't teach rate. We can teach accuracy. We can teach prosody or expression. We can't teach rate. That comes from practice and from doing. So we have to provide that opportunity for kids to practice and practice and practice and practice with text that they can read with accuracy. If we give them text that they don't have the skills to read with accuracy, rate doesn't come through the practice. We teach them to be fast mumblers. So rate doesn't come from the practice. It has to be text that we know they can read with that accuracy. All right, so now let's go back and look at action step 3. And let's look at activities then that we can use. So individual oral reading with support, recording devices, computerized reading devices. So anybody in here use any of the apps that students can read into the app and it records them? And then you can listen to it back. Those can be highly motivating for students. I've worked with a lot of schools that have used that, and they can be really motivating for students, as long as they're reading what kind of text? That they can read with accuracy. That they can read with accuracy, that's right. Partner reading is another way. Most of these activities, what you want to think of, and I have another slide later in here that I talk about celebrating and motivating. The whole idea of getting kids to reread and reread and reread for fluency practice texts that they can read with accuracy is you need to be celebrating and motivating them to do that rereading, right? If you just say, go reread that 10 times, what happens after about the second time? They're done. But if you're celebrating to motivate them, they will read from today till tomorrow the same text over and over and over again, and that's where the rate comes, is by that repeated reading and talking about the number of minutes spent doing that. Partner reading can be a lot of fun as long as we set up a routine that's really effective, right? Partner reading can also be a nightmare for teachers because we haven't set up a routine on what it looks like. So I'll give you an example of a routine. Can you come out, can you help me be my partner? Mm-hmm. All right. So one way that we think about it, we are partner fluency partners, okay, which can be very different than discussion or discourse partners when we're talking about comprehension in there, that we can have different levels of students. But we may be back at an earlier reading level where the text is all decodable, because that's the only thing that we have the skills to read with accuracy at this point. So we're going to have, I'll pretend this is our book. We're going to have one book in between us, because what happens if we both have a book? I have a book, she has a book, and it's my turn to read. What is she doing? Yeah, she's filling the void with undesirables usually, which is why it becomes a nightmare. So we're going to have one book, and we have a role. I'm the leader, she's the reader. When I'm the leader, I'm pointing under the words that she's reading. Now what do I have to be? Engaged and following along, right? So depending on the length of the text, if it's one page, then we reverse roles for the next page if there's enough text. If it's a short story, then I am the leader and she's the reader for one whole text, and then we switch and I hand the book to her, and then she's the leader and I'm the reader. A really fun thing that we did in one of the schools too is community building. We always talk about building community. It can be integrated into our instruction. So the teacher taught that part of the leader's role was to compliment the reader at the end of their section. So there's these little first grade boys, and they were Wrangler wearing cowboy boot, crew cut boys, you know, rough and tough. And the one was the leader, and he was pointing, and the one was reading, going along, gets to the end, and the boy goes, "That was marvelous," and handed the book to him, you know, and then they reversed and he did it, and the other little boy went to him and they go, "It's amazing how accurate you are." And they obviously, the teacher had taught them what it meant to compliment and had given them words and vocabulary, but they had these smiles on their faces and they kept going back and forth, totally engaged the entire time in reading, and reading, because they both had a routine that they were following. Thank you. So that's really what we want to talk about with any of these fluency things, is building those routines and then teaching them to the students so that you have that engagement and you have that motivation and that celebration with the students. While they're doing the partner reading, what is the teacher doing? Walking around, listening, providing motivation and celebration, feedback, monitoring. Choral reading in small groups with careful monitoring. Now, choral reading can be tricky because if I'm the best reader in the group and I'm having everybody choral read, what do some of those students start doing? They get super good at being that fraction of a second behind, and they're just repeating whatever that strong reader is. It's my least favorite strategy to use because of that issue. If we're working on certain maybe expression and we're trying to do some guided practice as far as expression or prosody, paying attention to punctuation, there might be a time for it, but it's my least favorite one that I see as being effective, you know, when students are doing fluency practice. Echo reading is the same thing. The echo reading is, I'm going to read a sentence using expression and prosody. You're going to repeat it back. So I could say, Martha the dog sat on the log. Now your turn. You weren't reading, were you? Right? And that's exactly what kids are going to do. Why? It's going to be done in really short segments, only for the purpose of practicing what expression or prosody sounds like. And that's the only point of that. Alternated reading, where the reader and a more experienced reader take turns reading continuous sections of text. And again, it's part of that modeling of what the text sounds like, but it's not necessarily going to help a student that's applying their own decoding skills, you know, that's there. So again, be careful with that one, but whatever your purpose is, be really clear on the one that you select. Simultaneous reading, where the student and teacher read the same text aloud at the same time. Why would we do that one? Engagement, but for fluency practice. What would be our goal for fluency practice? Yep, it might be pushing them along at a little bit faster rate to practice. Yep, that's right. Yep. So if they're going through, it's going to improve their pacing. It could help them hear the prosody and expression that you're using. It will help them know that you're getting into that rhythm of reading, right? And that you're paying attention to the punctuation in there. But also, what's the danger of it? Students aren't really applying their own skills necessarily, that they could just be parroting along with you. So when you're working with teachers and talking about these different ideas of fluency practice, it's really important that you talk about routines, that you talk about the purpose, why are we using these different pieces, what are the texts that we're using, in order for it to be effective fluency practice. So let's talk about the different kinds of text. So in the kinds of text, the text type, if you look up here, we have pattern text. And that's, I see the dog, I see the ball, I see the cat. And every page, there's going to be a picture clue, right? So we're teaching them concepts of print, using picture clues, high frequency words, I see the, right? And then we look at the picture and we know what the last word is. But once you know the pattern of that first page, do you really even need to look at the words on the next page, yes or no? No. You don't have to, right? If you're doing concepts of print, you're going to have them pointing so that you know that you're practicing starting at the beginning and that there's word-to-word matching, you know, as they go across. But that has to be part of that instruction when you're using that text with that. Rebus text is really the same kind of idea. High frequency word practice, concepts of print is what you're teaching. And that's, it might be I see the, and then there's a little rebus of a ball. You know, whatever it is, so a bigger word that's on there. Decodable texts are what we're using for students to examine words using all of that, the skill practice that we had been working on. So that sounds practice, the sound spelling cards that we've done, the blending practice, the words in isolation. Now, a decodable text means 80% or more of that text is jam-packed with all of those words that include those sound spellings or the irregular words that that we've memorized, you know, that don't follow those sound spellings. And so it's so jam-packed, and if I'm practicing it for that fluency practice as well, that it's going to help me internalize decoding words with those sound spellings and memorize those. So after we've done that for a while, we certainly opened up the types of text that we have the ability to read if we've internalized how to read words with those sound spelling patterns. Leveled texts are written to follow a certain type of criteria. Typically, if you have your guided reading rooms or you have leveled texts that go with your different core programs, they're additional practice for vocabulary and comprehension practice that's following your scope and sequence there. But they are not decodable text. Even your below-leveled readers or your lower-leveled guided reading books are not following the decodable text formula of 80% or more of the words following those sound spelling patterns that have been taught. So even though it says below level, does not mean your below-leveled readers are going to have the skills to be able to read those books with accuracy to use for fluency practice. So be really careful about the purpose of choosing those books and what the accuracy skills are of your students. Thinking back to that frustration level, independent level, or what's in between instructional level and independent level. So thinking about what it means for your students, and you need to have that independent level for that fluency practice, or at the very least that instructional level that they still can read with fluency. And then the authentic literature text, so if you have a traditional core using the anthology anchor text, are usually words that are just written for the enjoyment of sending a message for that story, whether it's narrative text or information text. Again, what students have the ability to read those that can be rereading and reading those for fluency practice. Our goal is all of our kids, right? Regardless of what grade you are on, the goal is that all of the kids can. But that's not true for some of the kids. And if we have that goal of every kid every day feeling and sounding like a fluent reader, and we gave them an anthology anchored text story, are they going to reach that goal, yes or no? No. So we have to choose the text that they'll be able to do that for. So really be thinking about the kind of text that you're going to use. All right, and I noticed that I have a mistake on this slide, which I apologize for, on number 1. I didn't change it from another one when I did this, so I apologize. The first read is for accuracy, is what that should say. So the first read is for accuracy. when we're thinking about fluency instruction. It's not for rate, it's not for expression, it's not to see how fast you can go. We want to make sure you truly can read it with accuracy. The second read, students should do on their own. In the video, when they got to the longer text, all of the students were reading that, they were whisper reading the text, and the teacher was going around and stopping them when they were making a mistake and modeling for them that self-monitoring during their fluency practice. But all of the students were individually whisper reading. Now, why do we want to have the students individually whisper reading? Because how many students are practicing? All. Partner reading even, 50% of the time you're not reading, right? So you actually cut the amount of time in half when you go to partner reading. Where everybody is whisper reading, everybody's getting the minutes on the tongue, where they're getting that practice. The third plus read, students reread the text 3 or more times in order to progress to appropriate fluency rates. That's where you want to kind of use that list of what are the ways that we can motivate and encourage kids to read and read and read and read some more. And what that looks like. So I talked about this partner routine on the earlier one. So I do have on the slide, I have the steps for the partner reading. Use only one book, have a leader reader, have the jobs, switch jobs, add in the compliments, teaching the students to compliment each other, build that community that's in there. Celebrate student success, provide motivation. I had a teacher come up to me, she's a first grade teacher, she said, Carol, you talked about students reading a text 8 to 10 times for fluency practice. This was a first grade teacher, 10 to 15 minutes a day. And she said, I laughed and I was like, no way will my kids read that many times. It's not gonna happen. And a year later she came back and she said, no. She goes, they will. They'll read it again and again and again when it's the right text that they feel and sound like a fluent reader, and you're providing that celebration to motivate students. They will reread and reread and reread again, when you have those pieces in there. All right, any questions with the fluency? Yes? I was trying to go through that really, really fast. Yeah, it's just we put together a manual after our enhanced core reading instruction study, and so it was left over from that. So it's chapter 8 of our teacher workbook that goes with that. Yeah. I know, right at the break, I said to Nancy, and I'm like, oh, I just found a mistake. It's the first one I made all day. All right, so recommendation 4, pull out your note sheet. And what I want you guys doing with your group is how do the fluency actions and activities that we talked about in recommendation 4 compare to what's happening in your district, in your schools, in your tier 1 and tier 2, and then select 2 to 3 actions of what are some ways that you can increase your fluency practice, your recommendation 4 actions that will make a difference for students, that you can reach that goal of every student every day feeling and sounding like a fluent reader. So take some time and talk at your table. So hopefully you have some of those actions written down for recommendation 4. And again, tomorrow in our group, as we're going through and the work that we're going to do tomorrow, we want you referring back to these actions that you've talked about from these 4 recommendations today. Doesn't do us any good to come to a workshop and talk about them if we don't have an implementation plan, of how we're going to put something back into place. One thing, I know some more questions had come up about the chapter 8, my mistake of chapter 8, leaving that in there. Really the idea with that fluency practice, there isn't a different routine for fluency other than what we talked about. So what we talk about with that accuracy routine is that we're going word by word, making sure that students are able to read each of the words in the text for accuracy, before we have them go on to the next reads where they're doing partner reading or they're doing whisper reading. We're guiding them through for accuracy. And again, that's where I say that time. If there's something that you can take back as a gift to your students, is giving them time to think about each individual word. Typically, when we read through a text the first time, we'll do choral reading, where we're all reading together. I might be a fast reader, I might be a really slow reader, and what have we done? We've left behind the slow reader. So we slow it down and do word by word reading with time in between each word for each of the students to have an opportunity to figure out what the word is. And that's exactly what I did with the little boy that said it was his best day ever. It was probably the first time he had actually been given time on his own instead of that first read be a choral read. Does that make sense? So hopefully that answers that question. Any other questions or any comments that came up with recommendation 4 before we move on? I'll look it up. When we're finishing up, and I know you have some things, I'll look it up. And if I don't have it for you today, I will tomorrow. Anybody else have one they use that they can share, name of the app where the students read into it? I always forget it, but I'll look it up for you. No, this is a free app. I'll look it up. I'll look it up and find it. There is a voice record, but there's actually an educational app that schools have been really happy with. Maybe voice record is one as well, but the app that the teachers use, the students all have an account, and so the teacher can go back in and actually listen to how the students sound and what they record. Say it again. Seesaw? Maybe. There's more than one. Yeah, there's more than one. So that one could be. I'll look up and see what I can find.